Welcome to this week's Points to Ponder. Our point this week comes from the gospel that's assigned for the 16th Sunday after Pentecost. That's in the Gospel of Matthew chapter 20, verses 1 through 16. And in that passage, Jesus tells a parable, and it goes something like this. The kingdom of heaven is somewhat like a landowner who needs workers for his vineyard. So he goes early in the morning to the marketplace because that's where workers went in that time to get work. He goes early in the morning and he sees some men that need work, and he goes up to them and he negotiates with them for a fee. And the fee that they all agree on is that he'll pay them a day's wage to come work in his vineyard. So everybody's happy. The landowner has workers, the workers have a job, and he sends them off to the vineyard. Well, a little bit later in the day, around 9 o'clock in the day, he decides that he'll go back to the marketplace. But when he gets to the marketplace, he notices there's still more men that are there with no job. No one has hired them. So he decides to hire them. He goes to them and he offers them a job working in his vineyard that day, and he tells them, he says, I'll just pay you what's right. Just trust me, I will pay you what is right to go work in the vineyard. They agree. They go to the vineyard. It gets to be about noon. And he comes back to the marketplace. He does the same thing. And the same thing happens at 3. He goes back to the marketplace at noon and again at 3, both times finding men who need work, both times promising to just give them what's right, hiring them and sending them off to the vineyard. Then he decides around 5, which would be probably just about an hour before quitting, he decides around 5 to go again. He goes back to the marketplace. And there are some men there who have not been hired. They have been there with nothing to do. So he asks them, why are you still standing here? And they say, because no one has hired us. They obviously wanted to get work because they've stayed there and no one had hired them. So he decides to hire them. And he says to them the same thing he said to the people at 9, and the same thing he said at noon, the same thing he said at 3, now at 5, an hour before quitting time, he says, just go to the vineyard and start working, and I will do what's right by you. So, when evening comes, and it's time to quit work, the man calls his manager to him. And he tells the manager, go out in the vineyard, get all the workers together, bring them back here. I'll have this table set up so that I can pay them their wages. And then line them up. And I'd like for you to line the ones that didn't come until 5, put them first. And then put them in order by when they came to work in the vineyard. And so the man goes out and he gets everybody in line. That probably wasn't that easy a task. He puts them all in line. And first you have the people that came at 5, and then on down till finally at the very end of the line, are the men that he hired early in the morning. And as the wages begin to be given out, the men who are first, the ones who had been there just since 5, are absolutely amazed that he gave them a whole day's wage. I mean, he had told them he'd do what's right, but he gave them a whole day's wage. And then the next group came back, and they got a whole day's wage. And then the next came back, and they got a whole day's wage, until finally the last group to come were the people who had been there since early in the morning. And well, they walked up thinking, well, we've been here the longest. He's going to give us even more than a day's wage. But when they get up there, yep, they got a day's wage too. And they were furious. They were absolutely furious. And he said, why are you mad? He said, didn't we agree on a day's wage, and it was a fair day's wage? Yeah. He said, well, you didn't lose anything. You're mad because in my generosity, I wanted to do what was right. Which leads us to our point to ponder for this week. Sometimes there is a difference between what is just and what seems right. My guest today is my friend and colleague, Sinead Doherty. Sinead, would you tell us a little about yourself?
Yes, thank you, Gayle. So my name is Sinead. I am a youth minister at the Church of the Good Samaritan in Cedar Bluff. I've been in that role for about 6 years now. I grew up at Good Sam. I have been there since I was very, very young, over 20 years at this point. And it's a really unique opportunity to serve in ministry at the parish that raised and formed me. Prior to that, I actually immigrated to the US from Canada. And so I hold that piece of identity as immigrant with a whole lot of white privilege as well. In my day job, in addition to being a youth leader, I am a trauma therapist. I work with children adopted from the child welfare system. And so I hold a lot of those trauma-related, trauma-informed beliefs in my ministry in the church. And that is a lot of why I do justice work and why I feel that this is so important as well.
So the point that came to mind when I pondered the gospel of the day was this. Sometimes there is a difference between what is just and what seems fair. And immediately your work with reparations with your youth group came to mind. So would you tell us about that?
Absolutely. So I have had a privilege as the youth leader in this group to have a lot of flexibility and a lot of opportunities to try new things and to really follow the youth where their interests lie. And we have a lot of social justice issues that really come up when we're working with these young people. And so in the past year or so, one of the issues that has come up is how do we, as a little, mostly white youth group in West Knoxville, make some impactful, meaningful action towards racial justice so we can do all the Bible studies and the learning and the conversations. But how do we really do something that makes an impact beyond just ourselves? And so reparations, which is a word that has lots of feelings for lots of people, did come up in several ways. And so the way that we are currently attempting to make a tiny reparation is through purchasing our supplies and food as much as possible through Black-owned or minority-owned businesses. And so we really put that into practice in the last few months. So for example, during our very alternative, very strange pandemic mission trip this summer, we committed to only purchasing food from Black-owned businesses. And we found several wonderful options, and we were able to do that. And we've continued that on throughout the summer in the very few times we've been able to meet. And so we've really just committed to not only doing that, but doing that even when it's harder, even when it's more expensive, even when we have to drive a little farther. And what I have found just in the few events that we've done this way, we're building relationships with people we might not have typically met. We are exploring parts of town we might not always get into. We're eating different kinds of food than we might just eat with our more comfortable, familiar catering options. And it has sparked some really important conversations amongst the kids, and then broadening out into the church as well.
So without betraying any confidences, can you tell me a little bit about some of the types of conversations you've had?
Yes, one of the things I love about my youth group is they are just very open and honest. And so we've had a lot of conversations about this food isn't always familiar, or this part of town is not familiar. We've also had a lot of conversations about judgments we might have made. So thinking about restaurants when we're going to pick up food. listening to the kids talk about how they've driven past that place 50 times before and never even noticed it was there. Or they've noticed it and thought, ooh, I wouldn't go there, but they couldn't put words to why. They didn't understand why. They just knew that wasn't somewhere they would feel comfortable. And so we've really been challenging, what does comfortable mean? Is that tied to some white supremacist sort of internalized things we've heard from others? Are these parts of town dangerous and scary because trusted adults in our life tell us that? And are they really dangerous and scary, or is that just something we've always heard? So we've had some really beautiful conversations about breaking down some of those sort of internalized messages we've heard, and really challenging these young people, many of whom are just starting to drive. So they're at a point in their life where they can go places, they can purchase from different kinds of businesses. Why is it that this one is so much scarier than, something on your side of town or something you're more familiar with? So we've had some really beautiful conversations around that. We've also had some really interesting conversations about the kinds of food we are comfortable eating. We did use one minority-owned business that was Middle Eastern food, and it was shell shock for many of our kids, and talking about just the different ways that we're raised and what's comfortable and familiar, and how broadening our palette and our horizons can also be tied into some of the justice issues and justice conversations that they so much want to have. So how we can use food even as one of those tools of kind of dismantling this somewhat white supremacist worldview that is very easy to find when you don't step out of your comfort zone.
Yes. Yes. When you find your kids talking about justice, what are some of the things that they say? What are some of the things they're concerned about, issues they raise?
Yes, I love hearing from the young people about what they're passionate about, because I think it gives us as the adults in the church so much guidance of where the next generation wants us to be and what they see that we're doing well and not doing well. I think right now, racial justice is a huge issue, and I think a lot of our young people feel that they don't get that education or that chance to have those hard conversations anywhere else, and they're craving that. They need that. And I think a lot of them feel like in our churches, we are very quiet. We say the right things, but maybe we're not showing up to events where young people are. Maybe we aren't giving sermons that are strongly worded in support of issues. They're very polite and vague and casual, and our kids want to hear adults commit to what they believe. They want to hear us say it so they can feel comfortable knowing that without a shadow of a doubt, their church is anti-racist, not just politely, quietly not racist, but anti-racist. I also hear the kids talking about lots of other justice issues, and we use intersectionality a lot. So really talking about how your gender and your social class and your sexual orientation and all of these things tie in to make issues of equity and access so much more challenging. And so I think our young people are ready for this. I think they're having these conversations, and I think as a church, we can be the place they have those conversations and feel supported, and show them that we are more than just words, that we're here to support them with actions as well.
If you were going to encourage somebody outside of your own parish, or maybe outside of the church in general, to do work either with youth or with other people on this whole idea of justice and the interconnections, interrelationships, and how what affects one affects all, what would you say?
Yes, I would say find the young people in your life wherever they are and listen to them. I think so often, and especially as a church, we come in and we think we need to create new programming for them. We need to teach them. And I find they teach me a lot. And I find that my most meaningful interactions around this have always been in conversation, in listening to each other and forming ideas out of that, not always in curriculums and buying the right curriculum or in hosting exactly the right event. Most of my most meaningful conversations with our kids happen sitting somewhere in a park or getting ice cream or while we're doing a service project. And so just creating those spaces where young people can feel safe, can feel heard, and can feel like they have a voice, because I think they have a lot to teach us as adults. I think sometimes we come in with this power dynamic of I need to teach them, when in reality, I learn a lot from my young people. And so coming in very collaboratively and creating those spaces where they can have hard, real conversations, whether that's in the church or in your neighborhood or wherever you might find young people.
Mm-hmm. What do you think is one of the most important things you've learned from your young people?
Oh, everything. I have the unique position of having been one of these young people within the last decade, and now being on the other side as an adult. And so I think for me as a young person, I always learned the most when adults were willing to say they weren't always sure or they weren't always right, to question along with us, to say this is hard. And I find when I'm able to do that with my young people, they share so many very real, very vulnerable things. The one that has stood out the most to me this past year or so, though, is really this sense from some of our young people that they just aren't hearing what they need to hear from the church. They're getting the pretty words and the nice packaging, but maybe we're not always willing to go to the hard places and have those hard conversations, or even to do the hard things like committing to spending money in a very intentional way that does pay reparation in a teeny tiny way, because the word reparation scares us. And so those sorts of things. So I worry from my young people that we will lose them to other places other than the church that are willing to have those hard conversations and to get messy. And I think for me, Jesus is the perfect example of someone who is willing to get messy, and to say the things that offend and to stick to what he believed, even when it wasn't the popular opinion. And I hope those of us who are adults in the church will continue to grow in that area, so that our young people feel like they can stay and feel like we are truly there to support these issues in actions as well as words.
Thank you so much, Sinead.
Yes, thank you.